I used to think people's voices changed with the weather. That was my harmless explanation for it at first. A little softer in winter, a little sharper when the heat lingered too long. We all tell ourselves small stories like that when something feels off. We file it away so we can keep making toast, keep paying bills, keep ringing the plumber without turning life into a courtroom. I'm 72. I've lived in the same street long enough to watch the trees outgrow their own shadows. I've also lived long enough to know when the world has started speaking to me like I'm not quite in the room. It began with little things that didn't deserve arguments. My daughter Leanne started turning up more often. She would arrive with a bag of groceries and a bright, busy smile, like she'd been doing it for years and had simply forgotten to mention it. I didn't mind the company, but she wasn't visiting for a cup of tea. She was visiting with a list. "Dad, you're nearly out of milk." "I'm not." She'd open the fridge anyway, as if it might contradict me. Then she'd make a sound in the back of her throat that was meant to be affectionate. "There it is, see? Only a bit left." A bit left is not out. She'd laugh, but not at the joke. It was the kind of laugh that closes a conversation without agreeing. At the chemist, she began standing closer than usual. When I asked the pharmacist about my blood pressure tablets, Leanne answered before I could finish my sentence. "He gets a bit confused with the names," she said, smiling at the pharmacist, not at me. I looked at her. Confused was a strong word for a man who'd been taking the same medication for a decade. "I know the names," I said. "Of course you do," she replied, gently, as if I'd just insisted I could still run a mile. Even then, I didn't accuse her. I told myself she was anxious. She'd always been the careful one. I'd spent years appreciating that side of her. It was why I trusted her. The first time I noticed it wasn't Leanne's behavior at all. It was someone else's. On a Tuesday morning, I walked to the corner shop the way I always did. Slowly, because my right knee complains, but steadily. I stopped at Mrs. Stokes's fence. She was trimming her roses, her hands moving with practiced precision. "How's the hip?" I asked. She straightened, saw me, and her face did something I couldn't name. A softening. The sort of expression people wear when they're trying to be kind and don't know how. "Oh, love," she said. "How are you holding up?" "Holding up from what?" She blinked, then glanced down the street, as if someone might be listening. "Leanne said things have been a bit hard lately." A simple stillness went through me. The sensation of stepping onto a stair that isn't there. "What things?" I asked. Mrs. Stokes lowered her voice. "Your memory, dear. That you've been having moments." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. My memory was still the one thing I relied on. I remembered every tool in my shed, every neighbor's dog, every anniversary of every loss. "I haven't been having moments," I said. She reached through the gate and patted my forearm, the way people do when they don't believe you. "It's all right," she murmured. "You don't have to pretend with me." I walked away with my hands in my pockets, trying not to look back. The roses kept moving behind me like nothing had happened. At the shop, Tom behind the counter greeted me with a careful kind of cheerfulness. He'd known me since he was a teenager stocking shelves. "Morning," I said. "Morning," Tom answered, then hesitated. "You all right to carry that?" He nodded at the 2-liter bottle of milk I'd picked up. "I've carried milk my whole life," I said. "Yep, just checking." He smiled too quickly. As I paid, he slid the change into my palm like he was placing something fragile. Outside, I stood for a moment and listened. The street sounded the same. Birds, a distant mower. But something had shifted in the way people looked at me, as if I'd acquired a new label overnight. I went home and found Leanne's handwriting on a note stuck to the fridge. "Call Dr. Patel. Follow up." I stared at it for longer than I should have, and when my phone rang a few minutes later and I saw her name, I didn't answer straight away. When I did answer, she sounded relieved. "Dad, there you are." "I was here the whole time," I said. A pause followed, papers shifting. I could hear the smile forming before she spoke again. I just wanted to make sure you'd seen the note. Dr. Patel's office called me this morning. Why did they call you? Another pause, shorter this time. Well, I'm listed as your contact. For emergencies, I said. Not for my calendar. Yes, but they said you seemed unsure last time you were in. I pictured the appointment. I'd gone alone. I'd answered every question. I'd even joked with the nurse about the weather. Unsure about what? I asked. About how you've been feeling overall, she said. They thought it might help if I came along next time. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not anger, not fear. A quiet, tightening certainty. I don't need you there, I said. Silence stretched between us, long enough to feel deliberate. We'll see, she replied. Let's just keep an eye on things. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the grain in the wood. I'd built that table myself 30 years earlier. Chosen the timber. Measured twice. Cut once. I remembered every step of it, even now. The smell of sawdust. The way my hands had ached afterward. I wondered when that memory would stop counting as evidence. The changes came faster after that. Or maybe I was just better at seeing them. At bowls on Thursday afternoon, Harold leaned closer than usual when he spoke to me. You enjoying the game? He asked, louder than necessary. I always enjoy the game. He nodded slowly, as if I'd answered a different question. When it was my turn, he offered to steady me, one hand hovering near my elbow. I stepped away and rolled cleanly. The bowl landed exactly where I'd aimed it. Well done, he said, surprised. Later, as we packed up, I overheard him speaking to another man near the lockers. He's still got it, Harold said. Most days anyway. I didn't interrupt. I carried my bag out into the car park and sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. At the bank, the young woman behind the desk kept checking her screen after everything I said. You're withdrawing this amount today? She asked. Yes. And you're comfortable with that? I requested it. She smiled, apologetic. We'd just like to be careful. Careful of what? Of people making decisions they might regret. She didn't say mistakes. She didn't say fraud. She said people. And she said it while looking at me like I was already halfway elsewhere. When I told her I'd been managing my finances since before she was born, she nodded as though I'd shared a fond anecdote. That's wonderful, she said. You've done very well. Outside, my phone buzzed with a message from Leanne. Bank visit went okay? I didn't reply. That night, I lay awake and thought about how easily a story travels when it's wrapped in concern. How it opens doors. How it doesn't need proof, only repetition. I hadn't been excluded from anything yet. No one had told me I couldn't do something. They'd simply begun doing it for me. On Saturday morning, my neighbor Peter knocked on the door. He held a toolbox and wore the expression of someone bracing for disappointment. Leanne asked me to check the steps out back, he said. She's worried you might trip. I'm not worried, I replied. He shifted his weight. She said you wouldn't be. I stepped aside and let him in, watching as he examined the steps I'd walked 1,000 times. He tightened a screw that didn't need tightening and patted the rail approvingly. There, he said. That should help. As he left, he hesitated. She just wants what's best, he added. I closed the door behind him and leaned my forehead against the wood. For the first time, it occurred to me that whatever was being said about me was no longer something I could correct with facts. It was already settled. The following week, my name arrived places ahead of me. At the clinic, the nurse greeted me with the same careful warmth I'd begun to recognize everywhere else. How have you been managing at home? She asked, her eyes flicking briefly to the screen beside her. Managing what? I said. She smiled, professional and composed. Day-to-day things. I live alone, I replied. I cook, I clean, I garden, I drive. Yes, she said, typing. And how does that feel for you? I waited for the question to finish. It didn't. It feels like it always has, I said. When Dr. Patel came in, he didn't sit straight away. He stood by the desk, one hand resting on the back of the chair as if preparing to move again quickly. Leanne's shared some concerns, he began. I looked at him. You're my doctor. Yes, he said. And she's worried. I'm not, I replied. He nodded, the way people do when they've already written the next line in their head. We'll just keep monitoring things, he said. No harm in that. No, I agreed. No harm at all. But when I left, I noticed the follow-up appointment had already been scheduled. A longer one. And next to my name, in smaller print, it read, Family to attend. I didn't tear the paper. I folded it neatly and put it in my pocket. At the hardware store, the man who'd helped me choose decking screws for years insisted on loading my purchases into the car. I'm fine, I said. Of course, he replied. Just helping out. At church, the minister lowered his voice when he spoke to me and asked if I'd considered stepping back from organizing the Tuesday lunches. Just for a while, he said, until things settle. What things? I asked. He hesitated. You know. No, I thought. I don't. By then, friends had started checking in without asking questions. They'd ring, pause when I answered, and ask how I was really doing. If I said I was fine, they'd let the silence stretch, waiting for something else. Once, I tested it. I misplaced my glasses yesterday, I said. Oh, my friend Margaret replied softly. I found them, I added. They were on the table. Well, she said, that's good. Her relief felt misplaced, as though she'd been braced for a different ending. At home, Leanne reorganized my pantry without telling me. She labeled shelves, moved things lower, threw out tins she said were expired. I was going to use those, I said. She smiled. You won't miss them. I started noticing that my version of events was rarely the one people remembered. Harold swore I'd told him I was thinking of selling the house. Mrs. Stokes said I'd mentioned feeling unsafe at night. The minister said I'd asked about assisted living options. I hadn't said any of it. When I corrected them, they looked puzzled, then sympathetic. Oh, they'd say, maybe you were just thinking it. I began keeping notes. Small things, dates, conversations. Not to prove anything to anyone else, but to reassure myself that I still knew where my own thoughts ended. One evening, I overheard Leanne on the phone in the hallway. I know, she said quietly. He doesn't see it yet. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the kettle boil, watching the steam curl upward. I realized then that whatever picture was being painted of me, I was no longer holding the brush. I was the subject now, and everyone else was nodding along. By the time I understood what it was costing me, the damage had already settled into place. I noticed it first in the way people stopped asking my opinion. At the Bowls Club, decisions were made before I arrived. Times changed, roster shifts adjusted. When I asked why no one had mentioned it, someone would say, "We didn't want to confuse you," and then immediately look embarrassed, as if they'd said something out loud that was meant to stay unspoken. At church, my name was removed from the list of volunteers without discussion. The minister assured me it was temporary. Just until you're feeling stronger, he said. I feel the same as I always have, I replied. Yes, he said gently. That's what Leanne said too. It was said kindly. That was the worst part of it. Every step away from my own life was padded with good intentions. I tried for a while to correct the record. When Mrs. Stokes mentioned my night wandering, I told her I hadn't been out after dark in years. Oh, she said, surprised. Leanne must have misunderstood. When Harold told me he was glad I'd accepted help, I explained that I hadn't asked for any. Well, he said slowly, maybe you don't remember asking. At the bank, a note was added to my account requiring a second confirmation for larger withdrawals. I was told it was for my protection. At the clinic, questions were phrased differently. Do you feel safe making decisions on your own? Do you ever feel overwhelmed? Would it be a relief to have someone else take care of things? Each question assumed an answer I wasn't giving. The hardest moment came quietly. I rang my solicitor to update my will. A simple change, one I'd been considering for years. He listened, asked a few questions, then cleared his throat. I've had a call from your daughter, he said. She expressed some concern about capacity. I sat back in my chair. My capacity? I asked. She just wants to be sure everything is done properly, he continued. Perhaps we should arrange an assessment before proceeding. An assessment. As if my life had reached the point where it needed to be verified by a third party before it counted. I agreed to nothing. I ended the call politely. When I put the phone down, my hands were steady. That surprised me. What unsettled me wasn't the suggestion itself. It was the certainty behind it. The ease with which my authority had been set aside. That night, Leanne came over with dinner already cooked. I spoke to Mr. Harris, she said, setting containers on the bench. He thinks it's best to slow things down. I didn't ask you to speak to him, I replied. She looked genuinely hurt. I'm trying to help. I didn't consent to this, I said. Her expression shifted then. Not anger, not guilt, something firmer. You're not seeing the bigger picture, she said. What picture is that? She sighed. Everyone's worried, Dad. Because you told them to be. She didn't deny it. She just said, someone has to step in. That was when I understood something important. Correction no longer mattered. Every denial I offered sounded, to them, like part of the problem. Every attempt to assert myself was interpreted as resistance. My words weren't weighed on their own anymore. They were filtered through a story that had already been agreed upon. I stopped explaining after that. Not because I'd given up, but because I'd realized explanation was feeding the thing that was taking me apart. Silence, I decided, might be the only place left that still belonged to me. I began practicing it. Silence. Like a discipline. When Leanne spoke to neighbors in the driveway, I didn't step out to correct her. When the minister dropped by with pamphlets for independent living options, I accepted them, thanked him, and placed them neatly in a drawer. When the doctor asked if I wanted Leanne to join our appointments, I said, if it makes her feel better, and then said nothing else. At first, the quiet unsettled them. People are used to answers, even mild resistance. Silence leaves them unsure where to stand. Gradually, it became a kind of armor. Without my words to bend or reinterpret, they had nothing new to add to the story. I went about my days as I always had. Trimmed the hedge, paid bills, repainted the fence out front. No one noticed the work itself. They noticed only that it had been done and assumed someone must have helped. Leanne's been busy, Mrs. Stokes remarked one morning, admiring the fresh paint. I nodded and said, she has. There was no point arguing anymore. The truth didn't live in conversation. It lived quietly, in the rhythm of doing. A few weeks later, I called my solicitor again. This time, I didn't mention Leanne or anyone else. I asked for an appointment, in person, to discuss personal paperwork. When I arrived, he seemed surprised to see me alone. You're looking well, he said. I am well. He gestured for me to sit. About the matter we discussed. I've decided to make no changes, I said. But I'd like to add a clause for transparency. No one speaks on my behalf without written consent. He hesitated, then nodded. We can do that. It was small, but it was something. A record, my own handwriting, my own decision. Paper still carries a kind of authority the spoken word no longer does. When I left the office, the air outside felt lighter. Not vindication exactly, but something close to reclaiming gravity. The sense that my feet were again pressing firmly against the earth. Leanne didn't like it. She came by that weekend, her voice sharper than usual. "Why didn't you tell me about the solicitor?" "Because it was my appointment," I said. She frowned. "You're being difficult on purpose." "I'm being quiet on purpose," I corrected. That silenced her. For once, she didn't have a reply ready. Over the next few days, the calls lessened. The check-ins became polite rather than probing. Even the neighbors began speaking to me again in their normal voices, perhaps unsure whether the decline they'd been warned about had reversed or whether they'd simply misjudged it. I didn't clarify, let them wonder. I realized, with a calm sort of relief, that I didn't need to reclaim the story they told. I only needed to stop participating in it. Every time I refused to defend myself, the narrative lost a little of its audience. There's power in stillness, I learned. The kind that doesn't shout or prove or explain. It simply remains. Now I rise early each morning. I make coffee, read the paper, and sit by the window watching the light crawl across the garden. The world still speaks to me, softer than it used to, perhaps, but in tones I can finally recognize again. I no longer wait for anyone's version of me to arrive before I can begin the day. That story has ended.